Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. Welcome back to the autumn and winter season of Code for Thought 2022, and I hope you all had a decent break. Summer, for many of us in the Northern Hemisphere at least, is the time for holidays and rest. But maybe not so much this year with heat waves, droughts and wildfires, not to mention all the other stuff that goes on at the moment. Some of today's problems are, of course, exactly what many of us in research and science are working on. And research, as we know, needs software. What recent experiences with, for instance, the corona pandemic have shown is that sharing knowledge and results is crucial to advance scientific output. And this holds for software as well. Many of us are benefiting from access to software source code, and many of us are willing to share theirs. In an earlier interview, Teresa Gomez-Diaz from the University Gustave Eiffel in Paris emphasized the importance of software licensing to help sharing our work. In this episode, I'd like to continue on the theme of open and indeed free software. And so my guest for this episode is Bastien Guerry, who I met in Paris for the interview. In his blog, Bastien describes himself as a hacktivist. And in our conversation, Bastien stresses the importance of free software and highlights the 4 freedoms the Free Software Foundation wants to give creators, distributors and users of software. We also touch on his contribution to the Emacs editor and his role as maintainer. And here now my conversation with Bastien. Hello Bastien, welcome to the show, and thank you very much for seeing me in your apartment, actually, no less.
Hello.
Here in Paris.
Yeah, welcome. You're welcome here.
Bastien, before we start talking about free software and maybe a little bit later about research software engineering in France, maybe you can introduce yourself quickly.
Okay, so I'm Bastien Guerry and I'm a free software developer. I currently work at the French government trying to promote free software in public sector agencies, and so the use of free software and the publication of source code under a free software license. And having more free software developers within the administration in general.
And you spent some time in London, I think, at some stage.
Yeah, that was many years ago. Maybe you can hear by my Lucy accent. That was a long time ago. It was a nice time. I loved it.
Okay, good. Yeah. You describe yourself a hacktivist on your blog. So what does that mean, and what is your main mission?
My mission, I would say, is to convince people that software freedom is not just for software programmers and geeks in general. It's for everyone. I know it's hard to explain to your friends, family, and ordinary citizens how much impact software has in your life, but people start to get a sense of it. And the next step is to understand why software freedom and free software in general is so critical in this new landscape that is surrounding us. Not just computers, but everyday machines that we use and that start to get information on us. So all this new environment, technical environment, people know this is changing. People don't really understand how software works. So you have to explain how it works. And when you get there, you can explain why it's so important to share the control of software and to be fair with users. Because that's what free software is about. It's about, being fair to the users. It's a moral issue. Well, you, software producer, don't have a moral right to prevent me from executing the software the way I want or from doing anything else with the software.
Why do you think it is so important that the software is free?
Yeah, to prevent software producers to do the wrong stuff with their own software. It's a matter of power, sharing the power and sharing the ability to let users do what they want with the software. That is the 4 freedoms of free software, as we call it, like the freedom to execute, to copy the software, to modify, and to redistribute modifications.
Let's go back a little bit and define what free software actually is, because people talk about free software, then people talk about open software, and So what is your definition of free software?
So I stick to the traditional definition by the Free Software Foundation. So free software is a software which license guarantees that the user has the full freedom. The first one is to execute, the second one to copy, the third one to distribute the software, and the last one to modify and redistribute modifications. Once you have these four freedoms, then you have a free software. Open source, the term was coined in the late 90s as a way to fight against the spirit of the free software movement, which was really about changing the society and making it a very important moral issue, like fighting for fundamental rights for users, not to be controlled by software. And then the open source people came and say, well, we need to convince the business that free software is good for their business. And they did that very successfully. But sadly enough, it kind of obfuscates the moral issue behind all that. And I stick to the fact that it's still a moral issue. And I think history have shown how the free software movement and early guys were right about this. So open source software and free software are really the same software. You have basically two institutions.
Yeah.
One is the Free Software Foundation. The other one is the Open Source Initiative. They both have their definition, but both definitions boil down to the four freedoms that I've mentioned. So it's really the same software viewed in a different way for different purposes. One insisting on the moral issue and insisting on the users, and the other one insisting on the way software is developed by iterating over source code in a transparent way and fixing bugs more easily because of this iterative and transparent and public way of coding and so on and so on. But that there is this confusion that this might be different software. No, this is the same set of software.
Open software doesn't necessarily have to be free in the sense commercially free. So I'm thinking about some commercial vendors, for instance, that have open or that claim to have open source software, make it publicly available for people to download and use, but people can't modify the code other than having to go through a gate where it's then decided by the company whether they take that modification or not.
Yeah, business guys are very inventive in terms of blurring the lines. But so there is freeware where you can download and execute for free, but you don't have the source code. You also have open source code licenses, public code licenses around there where you can read the source code, but you don't have the right to modify it. Or sometimes you have the right to modify it for your own needs, but you don't have the right to redistribute and share your modifications. So that's not free software. There is a large variety of non-free software licenses. And even recently, you have Elasticsearch, Redis Labs, MongoDB switching to new licenses that wants to be more free software licenses than the traditional ones, but end up not being free software licenses because they they make a discrimination between users, between who has the right for the four freedoms and who hasn't. So, for example, the MongoDB licenses say, well, we need to fight against these big tech companies that use our software and make profit out of it without contributing back. So we will invent a new license that kind of forced them to contribute back or to release everything around the software that we made and that they use for their own profit. At the end of the day, it's really simple. It's whether you have these four freedoms or not.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Elasticsearch because Elasticsearch is exactly what I had in mind when I asked the question between open access and open source code, open source software and free software.
In a sense, I think for beginners, it looks very complex because all of these licenses and maybe the legal language is not very familiar to everyone. So you don't want to look at this and you feel like, oh, free software is all about licenses and all these different licenses. That's too much. What is the difference between the Apache 2.0 and the Eclipse public license? What is weak copyleft and all these complex notions? So you can go into details and be very technical about this. But as I said, at the end of the day, it's all about the 4 freedoms. And another remark is that I think it's good to have this variety of approaches. Even the inventions of Elasticsearch and Redis Labs and MongoDB, they have been pointing at some problems. So we need to listen to these problems. I personally think the license is not the solution for this kind of problems. I think the business should be the solution for business problems. And maybe the rules regulating the businesses that maybe administrations and governments are responsible for, but not the license. So that's my opinion. But it's good to have this variety of concerns and of attempt to answer these concerns by writing new licenses. I would prefer that these answers would be about doing business in a different way and raise alarms at different levels than just stepping backward and have a closed license.
So there is another thing that I picked up from your website, and you say that there is a myth about the internet revolution, one of self-organizing individuals building a free culture. So I was wondering, why do you think that is a myth? Because there's clearly this legend out there that the early days of internet, we want to democratize the world, everything is going to be free.
My reaction is more about what I would call pyjama activists. You know, you're in your room, you're alone, and you're changing the world bit by bit. And then that's right, you're doing something useful. And you're coordinating with other people, and Wikipedia is the example of, collective intelligence can do, and collective coordination and efforts in the same direction by many people around the world, and sharing rules, building new conventions. So it's not a complete myth, but there is something that too easily forgotten is the need for institutions. That was really a reaction about that. So even pyjama hackers, they build new institutions, but there is this myth that what they build is always against the established system. I would argue that the established system has been key in providing them an education and providing them computers and providing them with basic literacy about math and engineering, helping them become what they became. And in general, because I think software freedom should be for everyone, that's why I think we should rely more on institutions to support software freedom, not just on individual efforts. If you rely for something on individual efforts, it might work in some ways, but it doesn't scale.
The reason I'm asking this question is for a number of reasons, but main one is that in the early days of what we now call the internet, there were a number of different players, and it was an opportunity for the smaller guys as well as the bigger companies. But what we've seen over the past 20 years or so, particularly in the last few years, is a concentration of power into fewer and fewer hands. Therefore, the myth of complete democratization and everybody can basically do what they want, finding some way of self-organizing, that it might have led to this kind of elitism, to the fact that nowadays we end up with a handful of companies that pull all the strings.
Yeah, and I think for many time, like for 2 or 3 decades, the politicians were not interested or knowledgeable enough to get interested in the internet. And that was wrong. Everyone could see it would become big. But when you think about the way Microsoft missed the internet change with Internet Explorer being so poor of a web browser for so many years, because they were focused on something different than the internet. So if Microsoft was able to not see this huge wave, well, politicians have more excuses for not seeing it. But I think it was a guilty attitude of laissez-faire. That's also why I don't like this myth of, self-organizing communities, what was called at the moment the multitude in French, like the opposite of the people. The people is structured in fighting, in a Marxistian interpretation way, and the multitude is more like self-organizing individuals, but with no transcendent ideology and so on and so on. The politicians were believing in this multitude, but it was a laissez-faire that led to what you described with, big tech pulling all the strings. And I think big tech knew that this would lead to this, and that would be the big winners. We've not been collectively very clever about this. Otherwise, we would have called all the MPs and say, in 20 years, the problem will be fake news. And the freedom of speech will be spoiled by algorithms that control them, and so on and so on. We could see this coming, and the politicians were not mature enough to say, okay, we need to do something. Regulation is not a bad word. We did this in so many other technical areas for the last centuries. Many good things came out of regulation in terms of telecommunication companies.
It's funny how history repeats itself, because in the questions that we discussed beforehand, before this interview, there's an article that somebody else pointed out to me by Joe Freeman, who wrote about feminism, the tyranny of structurelessness, and where she bemoans the fact that a free-for-all, a laissez-faire, leads to a situation where only a few people take the strings in their hands, because when power doesn't become transparent, that's a problem.
Yeah, we observe the same in software communities. There is a large debate about whether code of conduct are good or bad. I think they're good. They are not a magic spell to solve every problems around, but you have something to agree on. And then you can have variation about what you do. You can discuss about, is it okay to have this variation? Do we need to stick very literally about every word in this code of conduct? What does this mean? But even this debate is good because you discuss of it, that you can build a community. Otherwise, when you just have implicit rules, of course, the strongest, with many quotes, just rule, and that's bad.
Yeah, but it leads to Darwinism, basically. So,
and part of this debate about code of conduct is because many people see them as a manifestation of a new ideology that would be bad per se. But if you just stick to the words and to what is said, then it's not ideology, it's just practical rules, and it's just recognizing that some may be suffering from the implicit chaotic structurelessness. And there is so much to do in this area. We need the best brains to work on this, really. That goes with the mission I said. If the mission is to convince everyone that software freedom is for everyone, if every software is kind of reflection of the community building it, of the ideas, of the intentions, then it means that for some software, it's really critical to have a reflection of a diverse community. Otherwise, you just have a reflection of the stereotypes du jour. If you build a software for new democratic consensus or whatever, like Decidim, for example, then you need to have a community that builds something together and to add features that fit everyone's needs. I take this example purposefully because Decidim is a very opinionated software in terms of what public consultation should be. What should be the process for bringing people together? And it's good to have this kind of opinionated software, and it would be good to have other software with other opinions. But the one with the more power, I guess, will be the one, a very diverse community of contributors.
Unfortunately, reality is a little bit different today, isn't it? Because we have powerful companies. I mean, if we talk about, for instance, bringing communities together, one thing that comes to mind immediately is social networks and how that is regulated. But it is now being regulated. So what it shows is that we're moving into kind of a direction what you outlined earlier, that software and its application needs regulation, and it needs regulation to make it fairer for everybody.
Yeah, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and algorithm, and where algorithms are used on these big platforms. We are just at the very beginning of what laws and regulation can do, but we're getting there. We are passing new laws in Europe, for example, that there was the GDPR, and then there are new laws to try to regulate things a bit more. And citizens have to be part of this discussion. You have courageous politicians who wants to go there and push for this, but everyone needs, not everyone, but if you have more citizens in this debate, then you get more consensual and rational attitude to it.
I'd like to change the subject a little bit, because you've been a contributor to Emacs. And I find it quite interesting because I used Emacs at university. So my first editing in Fortran for my sins. It's still used, Fortran, of course, but I used Emacs for a long time, and that was in the 1990s. So it's still around and still used.
It is. Of course it is.
So what makes it so successful then? And so then we can come to your contribution there.
Emacs is not just a software. Emacs is kind of the love of my life.
Is it really?
It's really so far my longest relationship.
Okay.
And I think many Emacsers would say it's more than a software. It's a way of life. So that's part of the definition.
Okay.
I dream of someone, and if someone who listens to your podcast, I dream of some Emacs ASMR to sleep at night, and listening to someone saying all the commands that are there. There is really something very deeply sensitive about Emacs. So it's been there for more than 30 years now.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's just that I've been using it at that time.
Okay, yeah. It's still used because it's stable, because it continues to attract very good hackers who contribute to it. And recently there was a huge bump in performance because some researchers and hackers implemented native compilation. That was, I'm not knowledgeable enough to know the details, but that was impressive work, community work, research, computer science research work, and then implemented the right way, and with Emacs maintainers being very reactive and discussion being passionate about this. So it's still there because it's stable and it continued to grow and to attract, I guess, some of the best developers around.
You've also been involved in org mode, which is part of Emacs now.
It's a mode. So Emacs comes with many different modes, programming modes and text modes, and different way of displaying the text when you're editing it, and to have contextual comments to edit it in a different way. And org mode was written by Carsten Dominic more than 15 years ago now, 16 years ago.
What is it?
It's a mode for organizing notes and tasks.
Okay.
You can use it as a publishing system, kind of markdown-based mode. So the syntax is a bit different. But if you want to write your PhD thesis and feel lazy about doing it in LaTeX, then you can write in org mode and export it in LaTeX. Some people do that.
Well, I wish I knew, because I've written mine in LaTeX, but there you go.
Sometimes there is...
Using Emacs, by the way.
Masochistic pleasure writing that in LaTeX, feeling expert about this, and I understand that. But with org mode, you can go faster, and you have all the benefit of having a very nice way of editing your text, restructuring it, creating tables very easily. For example, when you start creating tables with org mode, you can stop and you want to export your tables to LaTeX in a snap. So that's the first part about organizing notes and publishing, writing and publishing. Many non-programmers, people come to Emacs because of org mode, because it's such a nice way to edit text and to structure it, and to have table of contents, indexes, and stuff like that.
When we talk about publishing, is it publishing to classical paper as you would do with LaTeX, or is it publishing to a web or?
Well, you have an export engine, and you can export to different formats like HTML, LaTeX, Markdown, Open Document Text. It's like Pandoc within Emacs. That's quite powerful. And the other part of org mode is about tasks and organizing to-do lists. You can start with very basic rules of just adding to-dos and then add up priorities and then tags and then properties and make it as complex as you want. But for to-dos and keeping an agenda, that's quite useful.
So what's your role in this, in org mode? What do you do there?
Carsten started, I think,
he started
18 years ago. I was just a user. I was really interested and then became a contributor. Carsten was so nice in accepting the contributions of someone who was not a professional programmer and was just passionate about this. Then I became more and more active. I became maintainer in 2011. And for the last 2 or 3 years, I'm just kind of a co-maintainer. The hard work is done by others, and today I'm a release manager. I try to supervise features, important bug fixes, and to ensure that the next bug fix or major release is good enough. But there are many people around doing the work of synchronizing with Emacs Git repository, of backporting fixes from Emacs to org mode, of dealing with questions on the mailing list. So I'm a bit less active. I'm far less active than I was 5 years ago. But I'm looking for the next maintainers and to retire. I think it's time. But as long as I'm not hurting the community and the project, I'm happy to be around and to try to provide ideas and maybe features. There was a lot of discussions about open source and free software maintainers. And it was good because you would realize that this role is both critical and underestimated. You had so many burnouts from maintainers that we had to understand what it means to be a maintainer. I'm one of the happy maintainer because I'm doing less these days, but I've always been so grateful about this opportunity to interact with the large community of passionate people. So I'm a happy free software maintainer. I think it's important to remind ourselves that there are some happy open source and free software maintainers out there. Otherwise, it's always...
If it becomes a chore, then that's difficult. Yeah. Because it's all the more surprising because your original background isn't in software, is it? Because you did a degree somewhere else, you told me.
Yeah. I was studying philosophy, but I was always attracted to software and programming when I was a teenager and was always kind of a hobby. And then became more and more of a hobby when I discovered GNU Linux in the late 90s. It was this feeling of being part of a global effort. I was actually downloading software illegally with cracking passwords and stuff like that.
Okay.
And then I installed Linux and GNU Linux, and it was written, you can use it the way you want. And if there is a bug, here is the email address, you can join. And so I just did that. I was so surprised that the global effort led to something so nice and so deeply rooted in the history of computer science. When you discover GNU Linux at the end of the 90s, then you discover the Unix history and something that goes 30 years back. So you try to learn about this history and about the Unix philosophy and about the various systems, and you get a bit passionate thinking, I thought everything was new, but it wasn't really.
No, I think some of that actually goes back quite a while. Like, for instance, the definition of free software that we started our conversation with, which is actually not
the definition
that new.
Of Lisp.
Indeed. Yeah,
that's another thing about Emacs is that it's so easy for beginners. Like me, like when I was not a professional programmer, I was just a hobby programmer and was not really doing that a lot. Still today, I wouldn't call myself a professional programmer. I'm writing Emacs Lisp and Clojure, but I'm not the best programmer out there. I'm really average. And I just love the way it works, and I love this Lisp languages and the beauty of it. And then when you open Emacs, you open this whole history, and you feel like you will encounter people who can explain you stuff about when they met someone at a conference, when they discussed this Lisp 1 versus Lisp 2 debate at the times. And
Okay.
It's great.
It's facing some tough competition, isn't it? Because, I mean, obviously there are other editors out there, and in particular for note-taking and tasks, there's a lot of commercial software out there. So
Yeah.
how do you fare against all of this? There's the big commercial world out there, and then there's Emacs. Still running strong, I understand.
Well, I think the Emacs community of users is probably smaller than the community around other big editors. But that's okay. What I mentioned earlier about stability, it's still going on. And that was the topic of blog rant by Steve Yeager that was famous for blog rants. And well, Emacs is all about stability. And if you want this, then you still have it. And also, I guess Richard Stallman being the creator of Emacs, there is an aura around this software that attracts very, very skilled people and continue to nurture this flourishing discussion about what we should do next. Also, maybe the internet, maybe the web, and maybe all social networks. Even the ones that are completely closed, but the ones that have a lot of geeks, like Reddit, was really good for Emacs because people were able to share stuff differently and to inspire each other, sharing configuration in a different way and helping beginners.
It's good to see that actually go on. Maybe we can sort of finish our conversation with something a little bit different. The position of research software engineers. We talked about this briefly before the interview, and we started comparing notes of how things are running in different countries. So I'm here in the UK. In the UK, there are more universities that actually have dedicated and permanent roles for people who write software for research. But what's it like in France?
We had this discussion back in January. We had a seminar. The main focus was on free software for research in the research sector. And one thing that people said was it's difficult to lead a free software project, a free software research project, because the lead developers and maintainers are often on short-term contracts. It's not just PhD and postdoctoral students, could be also ingénieur d'études, ingénieur de recherche. I don't know how to.
Yeah, okay, but these are the positions. Okay.
Well, engineers, but they're not often enough in a permanent position. So it's problematic because you start committing into fixing and building a nice community, for example. If you have two very motivated engineers, and then suddenly 3 years after that, they have to leave and to move, so they will continue on a volunteer basis. But we need to make an effort to have more long-term contracts for these people and the skills they have. We need to recognize computer science and software programming itself as a research skill, not just for everyone. I'm sure it's useful for everyone, but this institutionalization of having a pool of software programmers being able to help different researchers around would be really very nice, and more long-term positions for researchers, for programmers within the research sector.
Right. And do you see that it's something that will happen in France?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know. I wish. I'm optimistic because last year there is this national program about research, about open research in general. And last year was the source code were introduced for the sake of reproducible research and also for the sake of mutualization and putting more efforts and energy and probably money into building useful free software for the scientific communities around. So it goes in the right direction. But I won't predict the future. I'm just trying to cope with it.
So talking about the future, so what's next for you then, so in your battle for free software?
Well, I don't know. If I go back and look at the last 40 years, I would say, there has been a change of ages. 70s was the hackers' age. Then came the GNU project, which was really a big change, the GNU project in the Free Software Foundation, because now every hacker in the world had a very precise objective of building a free operating system. And then came Linux, the kernel, which was an opportunity to bring free software ideas to both citizens and businesses. Citizens were a bit shy about these free software ideas, but businesses were really there. They invented open source, as I said. And after this decade, it was more like a kind of a horizontal growth of these open ideas. So open data, open access, open knowledge, open everything. So it was like spreading the seminal and core ideas of free software beyond software. What I think is that during this decade, the last one, we had many of this open new thing go successfully, but too much laissez-faire, as I said, and we are changing the direction. So it's not, the next decade will be less laissez-faire and more governments willing to have an opinionated politics about strategy, digital public goods in general, and digital free software. I think this is the future, reinforcing the role of governments and administrations into playing their parts in this change. What government will be the first one to enter the Linux Foundation, for example? What are the relationships between the Free Software Foundation and this government? So there are big ambitions in China, for example, around open source. So when people will see what the different countries are doing based on public money, they will understand there is a strategic move. And I think it's not just for politics. It's not just the administration. It's really the citizens. So I think that's the way to make every citizen understand that you need to ask your MPs to be accountable of what happens in terms of regulating algorithm and regulating the freedom you have with source code.
Well, thank you very much, Bastien. It was a very fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
And I wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you very much.